From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Van Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. Now, Jason, I know you are traveling this week. Where in the world are you recording from?
I'm about 18 hours from my home base in Perth, in London. So I'm back in London. I think we've done some recordings when I've been here previously on another trip. So back again for the week.
We have, and I wonder, with jet lag and time differences, do you have any quick tips for our audience of how you manage a big time change like that and still take care of your well-being?
Yeah, I was waiting for the question today, actually. Like, Jason, what are you doing for your well-being? It's actually a lot about managing jet lag. It's about, it's an 8-hour time difference at the moment between Perth and the UK. So, it was about trying to get myself on time zone. So staying up late on the flight across. But then melatonin tablets are a godsend. And I never travel now across time zones without them. They are very, very helpful to help transition across to a new destination time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm a good international flyer, and I love the assistance of melatonin. And I also love just getting out in the sunshine as soon as I arrive where I arrive to kind of reset that circadian rhythm.
Oh, well, I wish it was sunny when I
excited.
arrived. It was 5 a.m. when I got in. It was dark. It was cold. It was a 30-degree temperature difference between Perth and London. So,
you're in London in January. What were you expecting?
But even Londoners are saying it's freaking cold at the moment. So it is cold.
What is happening on our planet? All of the temperatures are just messy right now. Nothing is as we expected, which maybe is a theme of flourishing despite all of the things the universe is throwing our way. Well, listeners, you just heard Dominic pop in, and I'm delighted to introduce him. Dom and I are on a Harvard community of practice together where we talk about the future of education. And I'm interested to learn more about Dominic and the work he does. He is the Director of Education and the Director of the Center for Educational Transformation at Salzburg Global Seminar, where he is responsible for the designing and developing and implementation of programs around the future of education. And I know he has a particular focus on social emotional learning and educational leadership. He also, I've heard him talk about regenerative education, and I am really curious about that topic, and education transformation, which is so important. So welcome, Dominic. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Given that I have met you before and Jason hasn't, I'm going to let Jason start with some questions.
Yeah, well, obviously you guys know each other fairly well, and this is my first time meeting Dom, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we have today. But Dom, for myself, as well as our listeners who aren't familiar with your work, maybe you could share in 5 minutes or less, your career to date and I guess what you're focused on currently.
Yeah, happily. Thank you very much. So I did Latin and history at university and wanted to become an academic, and had a place to do a master's in medieval literature where I'd done my undergrad. And I was in my final year as an undergrad, and my Latin supervisor said, I'd have a funny email this morning from a university in China who are looking for a Latin teacher. And I think realistically they want an English teacher, but they've added Latin to the job description because we have this relationship. Would you be interested? We'll hold the job. We'll hold the place on the master's program for you if you'd like to do it. So I was like, yeah, great, I'd love to do this. And so came out of the meeting, phoned my mum and said, I've got this job. I'm really excited. I'm going to go and teach Latin in China. And she was like, darling, I cannot speak to you when you're like this, and put the phone down on me. And then I went to do it. Loved being in China. It was a teacher training university in the northeast of China in Liaoning province. Realized within a few months of being there that actually working in education and international education was much closer to what I really wanted to do than academia and medieval literature might have been. So withdrew from the master's program, stayed in China for a couple of years, went back to the UK, did an MA in Chinese studies at SOAS instead, and then got a job with the British Council, which is a UK cultural relations organisation, supporting schools across the UK that were interested in teaching non-European foreign languages. So we were working with Chinese teachers and Japanese teachers and Russian teachers who were coming over to the UK to support the teaching of non-European foreign languages. Did that for a couple of years, was seconded back to Shanghai to work on the other half of the programme for a few months with the council, and then moved into school partnerships, which, this was back in 2005 when Charles Clarke was Secretary of State for Education in England. England had this amazingly enlightened international strategy at the time, where there was the aspiration that every primary and secondary school would have an international partnership. Every student would have an international experience or the chance to work on an international project while they were at school. And so I was part of a team that was kind of supporting the rollout of that and brokering school partnerships and district partnerships between UK and China, and to a smaller extent Russia and Japan. And then the program began to expand, got the chance to work in South Africa, in the Middle East, for short stints, kind of managing the creation of these new partnerships. And then with the British Council, moved to Bangladesh, was based in Bangladesh for 5 years in the end, managing support for South Asian schools who were going into these partnerships. So I worked with schools in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Nepal, and Bangladesh, obviously, who were entering into partnerships with schools in the UK. And we had teacher training funding, we had school leadership funding at the time, we had some research funding as well. Just amazing project to be part of at that point in time as well. Like in terms of security and being able to visit schools in Afghanistan, that was a sort of window of opportunity that didn't exist afterwards and hasn't really existed since. I think it's certainly, from a British Council perspective. So got to stay there for 5 years, absolutely loved it. Did a master's in education and international development at the same time. Then moved to Jakarta, doing a sort of similar-ish role across East Asia. That was also spectacular because you were working with education systems at very different stages of development. So countries or systems like Myanmar, who were a lot of the focus was on access and basic quality of education, through to systems like Hong Kong or South Korea or Singapore, that are at a very different stage of their conceptualization, I think, of the purpose of education and what the priorities were for funding for international relationships. Loved that, did that for a couple of years, then moved back to the UK into a more senior role back in London with the British Council. Then Brexit happened. My wife is French, we had a daughter by that point. London seemed less international in some ways, or less friendly, so I was interested in opportunities in Europe and thinking that we wanted our family to forefront their European identity. And then just through luck more than anything, I think I got invited to participate in a program in Salzburg, at Salzburg Global Seminar, around measurement and assessment of social and emotional learning. A lot of the work with the British Council had been at its heart about social and emotional learning. It wasn't articulated in quite that way at the time. We talked more about global citizenship education or core skills development or soft skills programs, but it was there's an enormous overlap with the social and emotional work. So got invited to participate in a program here, and then learned that they were also recruiting someone to lead the education work. So applied for the job while I was a participant in a 5-day program here, and was absolutely delighted to be offered it. And so moved to Salzburg in summer of 2017, and have been very happy here ever since. So in Salzburg, like you said, Tamara, in the introduction, I lead the education work. So we've had a lot of focus on social and emotional learning, but we've also, over the last 5 years, done an increasing amount of work in education leadership that we do in partnership with WISE, the World Innovation Summit in Education. We're building this body of work around regenerative education or climate education that we do in partnership with Children and Nature Network and many other partners. We have ongoing work around SEL with a really interesting consortium of partners we do work around education and displacement, and we do a lot of work around the role that education can play in supporting more inclusive futures.
Wow!
And,
So
it's
that's
fantastic.
quite the resume, Dominic, and you really put the international into international education, I believe, with I guess the breadth of different countries and cultures that you've participated in, both working and researching.
Just lucky to have different opportunities come up, and you're in a position to be able to say yes to them at the time when the opportunity comes up.
I'm interested if you could expand a little bit, because you say, I'm working with this. Give me an idea of what a day for you is like with all of this international. What is work for you? What is it that you're actually doing?
So Salzburg Global Seminar is a non-profit or independent non-profit. It was set up just after the Second World War in 1947. It's fundamentally a strategic convening organization. So we work like a think tank in many ways, but the way in which we try to support the incubation or the development of new ideas and new approaches is through strategic convening. So bringing together groups of people who are working on a common problem or challenge, but coming at that problem from different starting points. So different countries, different sectors at different stages in their careers. Pre-pandemic, most of that work was done in person. So we would invite groups to come and stay with us for typically between 3 and 5 days, and would take a very human-centered design approach to organising the time the group had together. So there was opportunity for people to share the insights that they knew to be true in their context, and then also get the group to a place of trust and understanding where people will talk quite candidly about the barriers that they face or the obstacles they run up against. And then can we think collectively and use the collective intelligence of the group and the kind of hinterlands of networks that everyone brings into this space to think about new solutions or reframing existing problems and the application of solutions that have been developed in one context to another. So a typical group would be between 30 to 50 people. And we, as much as possible, use this 4I framing when we're putting the groups together. So you want the group to be international, interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and inclusive as much as possible. Sometimes that, it doesn't make sense for the topic. You want it to be a peer learning group. So I work on one program, which is a network for education policymakers. And that is not interdisciplinary because they are all senior education policymakers, and that's by design. But in many of the programs, you want that interdisciplinarity and the intergenerational lens that this brings to it. So a lot of the day job is around the design of these programs. I said we're an independent non-profit, so a reasonable amount of time is spent with partners and looking for funding to be able to put the programs on so that you can remove the financial cost as a barrier to participation as much as possible. We were changed in many ways by the pandemic, and I think change for the better. We do a lot more online work, which creates different opportunities for involvement. We do a lot more hybrid programming, where you have a kind of online pre and post in-person program engagement. So we're starting to see the strength of connection and the strength of relationships improving because of you have a longer lead-in time and then a longer post-program connection as well. So yes, sorry, I could talk about it indefinitely.
It's fascinating to hear, Dominic, more and to understand how you're working with such international groups. And I love that you have that 4I framework in mind. I'm wondering, because I know our work together has focused a lot on the future of education. And so I'm curious, what do you think schools in the future could learn from the past?
I think there's an enormous, it's foolish and rash to not try and learn from the past. Obviously, the past is not going to be repeated in exactly the same way. But there are really interesting lessons. So I think, the way in which one of the big challenges in education at the moment is adapting. The current education systems globally have really been designed to reflect the dominant economic model in the 19th and 20th century. So that idea of, competition being the guiding ethos in many ways. It's sort of a lot of focus in many, many different systems about league tables, about ranking orders, and, which reflects the dominant global capitalist ideology in which a lot of these education systems were formed. That they're also, in many, many contexts, still a lot of colonial legacy, because that was the era in which mass public education was developed. And so there's a post-colonial discourse that needs to be engaged with. But these are also economic models or ways of organizing society which have created a lot of the problems that we're going to have to grapple with this century. So the idea of endless growth and things like that. And what we're starting to see now, I think, is a really important discourse within education transformation about collaboration being a much more important guiding ethos that reflects some of the new economic thinking. And so the lesson for education from the past is also being very critical of the economic system and the societal system in which your education systems are evolving, and not just mirroring or feeding in to that. So I think that would be the most important lesson. I also think, the mistakes from the past, that idea of, the thing which brings you into formal education almost everywhere around the world is the age, the year in which you were born. And there isn't enough recognition of the fact that children develop at very different stages. That might not be it almost certainly isn't the most effective way of managing your journey through education. So, there's a lot of good has obviously, unquestionably come out of education systems, but I think we're sort of getting very close to a point, if we haven't almost passed it, where there needs to be this radical rethinking around the fundamental purpose of education and how the systems are organized, so that we learn from the best of the past, but then also repeat the mistakes that have been made.
If you think of all of these different societies, do you hear similar messages around the lessons learned, or are they very distinct depending on where the school is and what their experience of this competition and capitalism, what part of history they came from? Or is it a similar message that you hear, Dominic?
I think there are definitely points of contact or similar threads that run through a transformation discourse or analysis in most systems. So, the recognition, the acknowledgement that the dominant education approach favors the people who have the most power or opportunity in society, and that marginalized groups are excluded in different ways in different systems. But I think that's a commonality in a way in which, if you, on the most sort of superficial level, perhaps, if you look at how textbooks depict populations in different countries, it is invariably the majority who dominate the depiction, and there's less space for representation of other groups or minorities. And so there's that, it perpetuates the sense of exclusion. And that's at the sort of most visible or superficial level, I think. And so, there's that recognition that one of the key agendas, I think, in education transformation is around how does it contribute to more inclusive futures. I think another area which is really important is, historically and still to this point in time, there's been so much focus on academic outcomes, and that's the basis for a lot of the league tables and the hierarchy. And yet we know that there is a global mental health epidemic for young people. We know that in different ways, different groups have been massively affected by the pandemic and disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But even pre-pandemic, there was a growing mental health crisis. Education doesn't allow or recognize time for a focus on health and well-being, on emotional literacy. There's so much pressure on the academic outcome. So I think that's also a common thread across many, many systems, and something where you see points of contact in the transformation discourse.
Yeah, and that's obviously something that is the focus of the podcast, looking at education institutions as a very good place to intervene in relation to improving the wellbeing of students, and not just for their time in adolescence or teenagehood. But, post graduation, how can they go out into society and be healthy adults as well and reduce the mental health burden on society?
No, absolutely. And I think, there's another trend which in some ways is connected with that is, the role that formal education plays in the life that you get to lead as an adult is becoming less and less about the direct knowledge that you've acquired or the academic qualifications, and it is much more about the skills that you acquire around learning to learn and lifelong learning, and the relationship between that and flourishing as an adult or being able to adapt, as well as exactly like you said, good mental health practice. We've been lucky in Salzburg to do a reasonable amount of work with Mark Brackett and the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And the work that Mark and his team have been doing around emotional literacy, I think, is fantastic. And just expanding the vocabulary that students and young learners and teachers have to talk about the different emotions and understanding the relationship between how you're feeling and your capacity to engage in a classroom context is brilliant and absolutely really important for the future of schooling and for healthier societies to have a more honest emotional discourse is really important. So I'm from England, and one of the stereotypes around English people is that sort of buttoned up idea of repression. And Jason, you're in London at the moment, so you may be experiencing this firsthand. But having a more honest emotional discourse, I think there's an abundance of evidence that looks at the connection between that and well-being.
I love Mark's work, and what you're saying about kind of that buttoned up really resonates with me. And one thing I often wonder about is the role of a teacher in shifting the narrative around how we talk about emotions and how we show others the emotions that we're experiencing. I think that often that's a piece that's left out, that we are telling the kids to learn emotional granularity without demonstrating it as the adults in their life. And so that's a piece that certainly I think is very different culturally from what I understand of kind of the emotional affect that is acceptable in different places. Have you seen anything around that, Dominic?
I think, definitely. It comes up quite often in the sort of social and emotional learning reform conversations that, I have a Japanese friend who's an education economist with the World Bank, and he uses the example of assertiveness, as one example of this, that assertiveness is not valued in Japan in the same way that it is in North America or Europe. It's not seen as a good quality or an asset in many Japanese contexts. So there isn't a sort of universal approach to social and emotional learning or to emotional discourse. And, it's important to be aware of that. But I think that it's also the case that there are probably some fundamental common human emotions or ways of interacting that could have, so empathy, for example, or compassion is a skill or a behavior or an emotion that resonates across, I would imagine, pretty much every culture in the world. And so, I think it's possible with the SEL work that you could build a common core of key social and emotional behaviors and skills that could be nurtured and cultivated. And then you have, the specific cultural context around that, which would vary from Japan to England, for argument's sake.
Dominic, I'm curious in this discussion, going back to the intro you introduced as the director of the Centre for Education Transformation. Why transformation and not reformation?
So what we felt in Salzburg, that there's been a lot of focus on kind of incremental reform over the last 15, 20 years, and the recognition that the education system was designed at a particular point in time, and we'd moved, societies and economies had moved beyond that point in time. We also thought, and lots of other people were saying the same thing, and we had the chance to engage with lots of other partners and and researchers around this when we were trying to shape what the centre would focus on. That there was a very specific window of opportunity at the current moment in time to support quite profound transformation in a way that hadn't existed in the last 20 years or maybe even longer. And that window of opportunity exists for a couple of reasons connected to the recent past, and then also a couple of reasons connected to political economy in the near future. So, pre-pandemic, there were these really significant global social justice movements gaining traction globally that were supporting or engaging with long overdue recalibrations around how societies organise themselves. So the work of Black Lives Matters, the work around Me Too, being two of the most visible and most well known. You also had the way in which the climate crisis was beginning to impact on more and more people's lives, and the idea that climate justice was not being discussed in the right way, that people growing up in Western Europe or North America or Australia or New Zealand have a much more significant carbon footprint than people growing up in countries that bear the brunt of a lot of that climate change. So you had, this was beginning, I think, to impact on education and education thinking. Then you had the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way in which that shone a light on massive inequalities within and between different societies and systems. And it sparked a lot of interest. What you had at one point in 2020, 90% of the world's school-age children were out of school because of school closures. So suddenly parents around the world were also much, much more invested in the minutiae of what happens in the classroom and the process of learning, and were becoming more engaged in conversations around what was really important in education, and the kind of understanding of the social and the emotional value of education. So all of that has contributed to, I think, a much more interesting and open discussion around the need for transformation, and the incremental reform wasn't getting us to where we needed to get to. And then you've also got the global 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, the fact that no country on earth, I think, is on track to meet any of their SDG targets, and SDG 4, the education SDG, has been knocked further adrift because of the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is a much greater political appetite for conversations about profound transformation because of this 2030 agenda. And so what we hope we can do, is over the next 7 years, is support systems and countries and who want to really engage with this process of transformation, act as a place where different system leaders can come and meet peers or learn from other sectors who've been through a transformation process or are engaging on a transformation process. Because it's not going to look the same in any two countries or any two systems. Everyone's starting from a different space, and the nature of the transformation will vary. But I think what is true is that wholesale transformation is needed.
Yeah, and it's pretty apparent from how you're talking about, what we have seen in the past of education, and there's such a big gap in terms of how we need to be educating students and what we need to be educating them about. And if we just did this slow reform, it's not going to be quick enough to adapt. But if the pandemic showed us anything, for the education system to survive, they can move very quickly if they need to and go completely online, for example, and do a massive change very quickly. So transformation is possible. Absolutely.
And the skills and the passion and the commitment from education workforce around the world was, really visible during the pandemic.
And I think an interesting point, as you said, that all of a sudden parents had their eyes on and had opinions about transforming education. And yet something I often hear from educators is we don't go to a bank and tell the bankers, just because we deal with money every day, we don't assume that we know better than them how our money should be cared for. We don't consider ourselves financial experts, but almost every parent that I talk to thinks of themselves as an education expert. They've been in school, they have kids in school, and they like to apply their direct experience of their education and their child's education onto how they think it should transform, which must be really challenging for an expert like you who has a very different perspective. How do you manage that?
There is always there's that kind of the cultural role that education and formal schooling plays, where it's a sort of transmission of received cultural knowledge about this is how we did it, so this is how you will do it, and these were the things, these were the values that were important for the people who are now in positions of power and policy design. I think though there's also a very real recognition from parents around the world and from ministers of education and system leaders that the world that we are preparing children currently in school to go into, to enter the nature of the workplace, the nature of the economy, the kind of societies, the way in which societies are more porous and fluid than they were, a generation ago, is very different. So, what worked to get them into positions of authority and power isn't necessarily going to, is almost certainly not going to work, because we're preparing people for a very different environment. I think most parents, I would say, I don't think this is particularly surprising, but almost all parents want the best for their children. So you think, and system leaders and ministers want their systems to be able to prepare to help young people develop the skills and prepare to live exciting, interesting, flourishing lives in the societies that they're going to live in. It's just we're going through a period of quite profound societal change and economic change, and climate is a massive factor in that. But there's also lots of work around identity. The things which are most important or valuable to try and achieve or do within school are also changing. I think it is much less about that transmission of a body of received knowledge, and a much stronger focus on skills and identity development, and thinking about the sort of relational skills that are so important. I would say that the other thing which I think is massively different and really shocking is the way in which the sort of capacity to disagree in a civil manner has been eroded over the last 20 years, and kind of the skills that are needed in the emotional self-regulation, all those things which are needed to navigate difference, even when that difference is a challenge to your identity, is very different. And that's a really important aspect, I think, to have the confidence in your own identity and your self-knowledge, so that you can find your place in a much more connected and complicated world. It feels like a really profound and important issue for education systems and schools to be grappling with from a very early stage.
It does, and I think you said it well when you said parents want their students to flourish, schools want their students to flourish. We're the Flourishing at School podcast, and so I want to ask you, from your almost multiplier perspective, if in a school community everyone is flourishing, they're feeling good and they're functioning well, how would you know? As a parent, as a multiplier, as the student, how do you know if you're getting this right?
I think engagement is a really good indicator. So whether that is happy engagement or angry engagement, if you're reacting to what is going on in school, it means you care about being there. So I think that's a reasonably good proxy indicator. There are other really effective. UNRWA, the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, has done some amazing work around the role of school councils in developing identity for Palestinian and Syrian refugee children, which I think is really interesting. So the degree of interest and willingness to serve on a class council or a school council is a good indicator of how much the children care about the institution, and have been able to put down roots in new contexts. And so there's interesting learning in lots of from that, and many other examples around that have grown up in contexts or been developed in contexts of crisis, that more mainstream, stable systems can also learn from.
That's probably the most unique answer that we've had to that question, don't you think, Jason? We've asked a lot of people, and certainly that's an outlier.
One of the really amazing and sort of things and great privileges about the job that I get to do at the moment is how you learn from so many different experts and amazing thinkers from around the world, and people who are kind of at the absolute front line of innovation in very different contexts.
It is a work in progress. We are all learning, and I think that's part of this transformation, part of these changing times, that we no longer know what we thought we knew. I think we've talked about a lot. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to say that's been left unsaid, Dominic or Jason, if there's any other questions that popped up from your perspective before we wind up today.
No, just thank you again for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you both.
Thank you for joining us and for generously sharing a perspective that's very unique and very global, and I can't wait for listeners to hear. So if you are listening to us, please share it with your peers. You can also watch us on the Flourish DX YouTube channel, and some people love to watch, some people love to listen. Again, I think this is how we're meeting all of the audiences. Jason and I are on LinkedIn. Dominic, are you on LinkedIn as well?
I am, yes.
Awesome.
Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter.
That's a place where listeners can connect with us to learn more about what Salzburg Global and Dominic and his team are doing. And that's it for this episode of the Flourishing at School podcast. We'll catch you on the next one. And until then, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.